Well, hello friends, and welcome to Ask Zach. Today we are going to take a deep dive on the Wide-Panel 1954 Princeton. I'm going to give you, of course, specs, features, stuff like that. We're also going to go back to 1946 with the release of the first Princeton, and I'm going to give you kind of how the model changed up through 54, and then of course we'll talk about the rest of the 50s and into about 1965. Just to kind of encapsulate the pre-CBS Princeton years. But yeah, we're going to do a deep dive on this Wide-Panel 1954 Princeton, and we'll do a little playing through it, and just so you can hear what it sounds like and just have a good time. First off, I just want to thank you for watching the show. Please give us a thumbs up, subscribe. If you've been watching for a while, I appreciate your support. There's multiple ways. There's tip jar information. There's merch like this Ask Zach t-shirt. Or you can support me on Patreon, which there's a link in the description to find out more about that. All right, let's dive in. So the Princeton model is really, really, really important in the Fender amp lineup. Reason being is not just a huge seller through the entire time that Fender has been around. It was also one of the very first amplifiers that was offered by Fender. Their initial offerings in 1946 were 3 models. They were the Princeton that had an 8-inch speaker and had a single output tube and had a 6V6 and a 5Y3 and an octal preamp tube. Then you had the Deluxe, which had 2 output tubes, 2 6V6s, and again an octal preamp tube and a 5Y3, and a 10-inch speaker. And then you had the top of the line Professional or Pro that was it had 2 6L6s and it had a 15-inch field coil speaker. And of course, all of these were what we call the woody amps, and I'll show a little picture here, where they had the wooden cabinets that were kind of natural finished, maybe lightly stained, and they had kind of a wooden handle that was built into the design and had kind of this velvety kind of velour kind of grill cloth. So that initial Princeton was a really interesting amp because they really were trying to make it as kind of beginner, friendly, and trying to make it as inexpensive as possible for the student. So this original 1946 Princeton had 2 inputs, no volume, no tone control, no on-off switch. Yes, that's right. If you wanted to turn it on, you plugged it in. If you wanted to turn it off, you unplugged it. They figured it didn't need a volume control because it was usually sold as a set with a steel guitar, a Fender steel guitar that had a volume control on it. And the reason it had 2 inputs was that it was designed to be used in teaching studios or, some teacher, teaching at their house or what have you. And so that way, you and your teacher could get your steel guitars out and you could slide around and learn how to play. Well, the woody amps went away and it made way for the TV front amps in 1948. And in 48, they decided to upgrade the Princeton. So at this point, it gets a volume control and it gets a tone control that has a built-in on-off switch. And this is also on this amp, and it makes this little click. Basically you turn the tone control all the way down and it makes a little click, and that turns it off, and then you click it and turn it back on, and then of course you can use the tone control as normal. Continued to have 2 inputs and of course the TV front design. But what that did was it made room at the bottom rung of the Fender amp lineup for another amp. So guess what? This is where the Champ comes in. So the Champ came in right underneath it, having a 6-inch speaker and a similar circuit. But it was interesting, it had all of the components kind of wired together. It didn't really have a circuit board, so it was kind of like it was like this direct, soldering, the way the components were kind of connected together. So that's where you get the Champ, and originally it was called the Champion 600. So now you have the Champion and the Princeton, and this is the way it's going to continue for a while. So again, TV front amp, it's very similar to the, it continues to have the octal preamp tube, the metal, preamp tube. And then in 1953, they changed from the TV front design to the wide panel tweed. And so you get this other, type of tweed material, and of course, what we call wide panel. The amp really didn't change much at first, besides, of course, the cabinet getting a little bigger. Then about 1954, which is what this is, Fender is finally phasing out those metal octal preamp tubes. And so this amp, because it's a 54, it has a 12AX7 in V1. So it has a 12AX7, a 6V6 power tube, and then it has a 5Y3 rectifier. So that kind of gets us up to this amp specifically. And this one was purchased by my friend Austin Skinner, and he got it at an estate sale. So, make sure and go to those as much as possible. And he picked this up, and it needed a little bit of repair work and stuff, but it's in, it's in pretty good shape. Obviously, it's missing the handle, and the leather handles that they put on these originally, they just tend to dry rot, and they just don't last. And so to find an original handle on a Fender, from the 50s is, it almost never happens. And if it did, it had to be an amp that was never picked up by the handle, or it's just been sitting somewhere for, a lifetime, a couple of lifetimes at this point. But yeah, so this is very common. And, of course, there's repros out there. Tweed's in good shape. Grill cloth's in good shape. Let's pick it up and show the chrome-plated chassis, which is very corroded, and it's got a lot of pitting in it and such. But yeah, but everything works. You can see the back of it's in really good condition. The chassis itself is really clean. Otherwise, it's just the top. I don't know what it was exposed to, salt air or what. But the rest of it is perfectly fine. Of course, you got some rusty glides on the bottom, but the tweed looks really good even on the bottom. And yeah, it's just a really, really cool little amp. And these are a very similar circuit to what the Champ becomes later on, because again, they kind of keep upgrading the amps, and all of them kind of rise up, and at times they of course bring in these other models to fit in the gap. But being that this has an 8-inch speaker, it's it's somewhat similar to the later Champ, when it got an 8-inch speaker and such. But yeah, that's enough talking about this. Let's kind of hear what it sounds like. So for the demo, I'm of course playing my 57 Esquire that has an added neck pickup, and I'm plugged in, and I've got the volume on 6, and I've got the tone on 3.5. And I start off kind of to clean it up a little bit. I back off the volume control on the Esquire just a little bit to kind of clean it up, and I play like a little kind of Jerry Reedish kind of funky thing. And then I turn the volume control all the way up so that you can kind of get a little bit of grit, and you can hear the stereotypical riff that probably anyone plays when they're demoing a Champ. And then I go to the neck pickup on the Esquire, and I turn the tone control all the way up so you can kind of hear, kind of the tonal range that it has, and also, hear a little bit of that, kind of dirty neck pickup sound, which is a lot of fun. So, yeah, so let's have a gander. hope you enjoyed that. Again, it's a cool little amp. Now, is it a one-trick pony? Well, not exactly, but it doesn't have like a ton of sounds in it. It can kind of clean up some, but obviously it doesn't have a ton of clean headroom. And this amp is pretty much original. It has the original 8-inch Jensen in it, which is it's pretty tired, but it's still, you know, holding together and such. But I've tried to be a little bit gentle with the amp, which is why I didn't turn the amp all the way up to 12, because I really don't want to be the guy that busts an original 8-inch Jensen Alnico speaker. So interesting things happen with the amp after this. Of course, in 55, later in 55, it changes to the narrow panel tweed, and also it brings forth another amp. So I'm going to put down my old Esquire so I can pick this up. So Fender adds an amp to the lineup in 55, 56, which is this Harvard. So this is actually a 59, but yeah, so this amp has you know, 2 output tubes and volume control, tone control, three inputs, and an actual on-off switch. And it became part of the line up, you know, right above the Princeton. And the Princeton actually gains the Harvard's cabinet. It gets a bigger cabinet in, I believe, 56. And it continues to be, you know, a tweed amp, single output tube, volume and tone control until 1960. Correction, it's actually 1961 when it gets brown Tolex. And then it completely changes. All of a sudden it gets, of course, Tolex brown, and it gets a volume control, which it already had, a tone control, which it already had. It gets an actual on-off switch, and it gets tremolo, and it gets a completely different circuit, and it gets a second output tube. And guess what? This Harvard disappears from the lineup because the Princeton has absolutely taken its place. And so who wins the university wars? Well, it's the Princeton. Harvard, you know, goes away. There are, of course, a few Harvards that are sold with remaining tweed Princeton chassis, and so that's a really rare amp. I've only seen one of them in person, but in essence, it's, you know, the Harvard cabinet with the Harvard nameplate, but then it's got the Princeton guts in it with 1 output tube, so it doesn't have, you know, it's 5 or 6 watts instead of being 12. So then, of course, you know, with the blackface amps, you get the blackface Princeton and the Princeton reverb, and that gets us through 1965. An interesting thing about the Princeton that you have to understand, especially when we're talking about pre-CBS Princetons, the Princeton was never designed to be a gigging amp. It was always designed to be a student model or a teaching model, and that's why it had 2 inputs, and you know, and the Deluxe was kind of the step up above that. But the Princeton reverb, of course, was, you know, really nice in that it had reverb and tremolo and had all these sounds, but it was not considered in any way, shape, or form a gigging amplifier. It only became a gigging amplifier when you started turning them up to 10, which they were never designed really to do that. You know, Leo thought everyone wanted to play clean, and so he thought people were going to run them around 3 or 5 or something like that, and certainly didn't want any type of overdrive going on. But as people started turning them up to 10 and getting them to distort, of course, you know, it was able to get a little bit louder and dirty. And then once you have, you know, the advent of modern PA systems and, you know, what we call sound reinforcement, which is where everything is mic'd up, and that comes about probably mid to late 70s, then all of a sudden the Princeton was a viable gigging amplifier, and you could play a really big gig with a Princeton or even a Champ. So it's interesting how that amp, you know, went from being really a beginner student model to being now considered a gigging amp. And I use a Princeton type amp all the time to gig with, and I love it. So Well, I just enjoyed getting to check this out, so I need to thank my buddy Austin. Also, you know, a lot of the historical information came from this out-of-print book that I love, and I hope that Hal Leonard will someday either allow it to be out, you know, digitally or reprint or something. But it's Fender Amps, the first 50 years by John Teagle and John Sprung. This is a really great book. Again, hopefully someday they'll come back out with that. All right, well, I hope you've enjoyed today's episode. Again, thanks to Austin for letting me borrow his Wide-Panel 1954 Princeton. It was a lot of fun. Now I got to return it. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.